Well, we're not dead yet, so let's keep moving forward. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Underworld, called Strawberry Hotel. Alright, I've just had several videos in a row underperform. Let's finally get one out for the algorithm and talk about an act that people outside of my usual viewer base actually know about. This will be my fourth time doing a video on the legendary techno duo of Carl Hyde and Rick Smith. Links to my previous 3 videos on them can be found in the description. This is one of those bands who have long been on that, mental lists of bands and artists I want to do discography reviews of someday, and would be a really obvious choice for one, but I just haven't gotten around to yet. I can't imagine I need to tell anyone who regularly watches my videos about how they became one of the biggest names in UK electronic music in the early mid-90s, in the days when they were a trio, including DJ Darren Emerson, helping to bring techno to a mainstream audience in the UK, putting out classic albums like Dub No Bass with My Headman, Second Toughest in the Infants, and Bo Coop Fish, or turning people's heads with their placement on the Trainspotting soundtrack through their single Born Slippy Knucks. They had a knack for putting together all these big epic techno arrangements with propulsive banging dance beats and Hyde's rambly off-the-cuff talk singing, adding that extra personality and flair you couldn't get from anyone else. Your mileage may vary a lot more on how they fared after Emerson left. I'd personally put the album they put out right after he left, 100 Days Off, right up on the exact same level of greatness as those first 3, and I might even slightly prefer it over Dub No Bass on a personal level, though I know there are plenty who would heavily disagree with me there. After that, though, they started to embark upon various more experimental directions and change-ups in sound, such as the kinda weird but not that weird down-tempo excursions on Oblivion with Bells, swerve into commercial EDM on Barking, another swerve into a post-rock influence direction on Barbara Barbara We Face a Shining Future. All generally fine albums from what I remember them, but none of which come anywhere near hitting the heights of the 90s. They were following a pretty common career arc for bands of their age, and at the time Barbara Barbara first came out and I did my own video catching up on their full catalog for the first time, I was just happy that they were still going and trying new things, even if in retrospect the results didn't always play to their strengths, and that album in particular, despite some really good moments, is also pretty scant and underbaked in comparison with their best. Eventually they got to a point where they got sick of the usual cycle of albums and tours and decided to take an even bigger swing by starting up a much larger scale experiment called Drift at the end of 2018. An ongoing series where they would try to release a new track every week for a year, or something every week for a year. It started out as a series of loose EPs, and by the time it reached its conclusion in late 2019, they had enough new original material to fill a box set of 6 CDs. Underworld are not the kind of band I ever would have expected to be able to pull off a project of that scale, but miraculously, it worked. Obviously, not to say that Drift is all hits all the way through, or that it wouldn't be a really exhausting listen if you tried to digest it all at once. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but not only was the ratio of good to bad through the full 6 hours way better than it had any right to be, not only did they both find a way to return to their roots and focus on the core of what made their sound work in the 90s without abandoning the artsier flares of their middle period stuff or ever making it feel like shallow nostalgia bait, finding a balance between the sprawling classic-style Underworld techno bangers and out-of-left-field experiments with enough variety to ensure you'd never get bored even if you sat through all 6 hours. But the best stuff from Drift is legit some of the best stuff Underworld have ever made, full stop, even including the Darren Emerson days. So many top-tier tracks of theirs: Border Country, Appleshine, Another Silent Way, Listen to Their No, Custard Speed Talk, Sonia Mode, STAR, Imagine a Box, Thread of Rain, just to name a few. And don't even get me started on the full 47-minute Appleshine continuum with the next. Holy shit, is that still absolutely incredible. Drift had so much good shit in it that I felt it was worth my time to drop over $100 to get my hands on the entire box set in physical form. And I put together a 2.5-hour mix just for my personal favorite moments from the series, currently immortalized in the only Spotify playlist I've ever made. And if my personal custom cut-down track listing had been like the official track listing and presented in a double CD package, I think that legit might be my favorite Underworld album, even over Second Toughest and Bo Coop Fish. Though that's not a reality we live in. Underworld had seemingly become unstoppable over the course of 2019, and they were even gutsy enough to call the box set Drift Series 1 and announce that they weren't even done with Drift yet, and that they wanted to just keep going into a second series. I suppose, though, if anything was guaranteed to stop them, it'd be an out-of-nowhere global pandemic. That pretty much brought those plans to a screeching halt and left the idea of it to become more distant and interest them less and less over time. Drift Series 2 may not have ever been officially cancelled, but you could tell the frantic intensity of the Drift schedule had seriously taken its toll on them. All the more confirmed when they finally decided to return to a traditional album cycle through releasing this latest project here, Strawberry Hotel. Honestly, as game as I would have been for more Drift, I wouldn't be heartbroken if we never got that Series 2. Even in 2019 when they announced the possibility, I was skeptical that it was a trick they could pull a second time. Honestly, I'm just happy to have seen something like Drift happen at all the one time, and for the results to have been as consistently good as they were. So now we got a regular old new album from them. The existence of Drift definitely raised my expectations for this higher than they probably would have been otherwise. I certainly messed with all the singles they were dropping through 2023, and The Color Red and Denver Luna were pretty standard, well-crafted Underworld techno bangers that sounded like they were continuing the same high average level of quality they showed on Drift. They also had a track in collaboration with Ketama called Fen Violet, which did not make the cut for this album, but I really wish it had, since it goes even harder than those other two. Worth going back to that if you missed it. I guess Black Poppies was also technically a single, though that's just the album intro and didn't make that much of an impact other than like acting as promo for the announcement that the album was happening at all. Anyway, as for my thoughts on Strawberry Hotel as a full package, it's really good. I had a lot of fun with it. There's nothing here that you haven't heard Underworld do before, but once again I do feel like the average level of quality is generally kept up from what they were doing on Drift, and they're sticking to what's worked for them without feeling the need to reinvent the wheel. It'll also obviously be much more easily approachable than Drift, purely on the merits of just being a standard-length hour-long album instead of a 6-hour box set. I will say, though, that the album is very much front-loaded. All the best stuff the album has to offer is gathered together in the first half, but man, did that first half have me excited, as I was like just getting banger after banger, and they were all exciting me in the same way that Underworld's best stuff can. Well, Black Poppies, as I mentioned, isn't the most impactful of intros. It's a nice enough beatless track, mostly built around Hyde's harmonized vocals and some light synth riffs in the background. The tune is generally pretty, though again it feels more like a quick warm-up for what's to come than any kind of notable highlight for the album taken on its own. Denver Luna is the functional opener and the point at which the album really starts to get going, and yeah, this track is pretty great. An 8-minute sprawl through propulsive techno beats and Hyde's usual rambling. The bass on this track is really damn strong as it builds up and down in a really exciting way, with a quick little vocoder section finally leading into one last big epic climax at the end. The whole thing very much hits me in a similar way to tracks of theirs like Border Country, and it's an excellent way for this album to really kick itself off. Really feels like it was built as a mission statement for what this album's about. It might also be my favorite track in the bunch, however it would be a very close call since all the following 5 tracks immediately after it are right about on par with it and could also be solid contenders for my favorite track as well. Techno Shinkansen goes entirely instrumental with all these bright trance synth plucks and rollicking bass lines and even a little bit of light house pianos for good measure. The track is over almost too quickly at 3.5 minutes, and I wouldn't have minded lingering on this idea for twice as long, but even in that short time, it still delivers one of the best tunes on the album, and leaves enough of an impact to cement itself as a highlight. And The Color Red isn't as bright or melodic, but it's a lot more focused on its driving bass-heavy groove, nearly all beats and percussion with some squirting effects on top, and Hyde's repetitive half-mumbled hooks are decently catchy. It hits a similar note for me that a track of theirs like Thread of Rain can, albeit obviously much more compressed down to a simple 5-6 minute arrangement. I really messed with it when I first heard it as a standalone single, and I'm happy to see it given a natural home on this album. Sweetland's Experience initially goes for much more of a playful and irreverent tone that vaguely reminds me of their track Sonya Mode, albeit without any of the blown out distortion. Got a bouncy synth bass line and Hyde's ranting about being more smashed than you were, but the track slowly twists around into a pretty epic build-up with lots more bright and colorful synth melodies and even some female backup vocals joining in the background. And the next 2 tracks sort of continue with similar ideas raised to even greater heights. In Pomona starts out pretty unassuming, with Hyde stripped back singing over a fairly low-key downtempo arrangement, but once again just raises itself into truly epic territory. Hyde does a lot of vocal harmonizing with himself that kind of reminds me of what he did on Imagine a Box. the backup vocalist from the previous track, who by the way is Rick Smith's daughter, Esme Bronwyn Smith, lets loose with some pretty impressive sounding wails. And that's not even to get into how the track switches up into this far more percussive and hammering mix near the end, which is absolutely freaking amazing. And then Hilo Sky is almost like a straightforward old school trance sort of mix that hits you with more stormy bass, thumping beats, bright arpeggios, and loads of huge epic build-ups reaching euphoric heights. That's another close candidate for my favorite track on the album. I've got nothing to complain about for this entire 6-track run from Denver Luna to Hilo Sky. It's all great, recaptures the vibes I enjoyed on Drift while repackaging them in a more accessible manner, and also makes sure that all those ideas can stand on their own merits without falling in the shadow of older tracks. And I was almost ready to call this whole album great while those tracks were going on. The second half of this album is still good, but there's definitely a clear slide off in quality after that run. The fall off isn't immediate. I do like Burst of Laughter even if it's not a standout. The way it transitions directly out of Hilo Sky is cool. There's a cool swung beat going behind that one, even if the arrangement feels more simplistic and less striking than the ideas that came before it. Feels like it serves its purpose and context as a sort of bridge between the two halves of the album. Where the album starts to lose me a little is King of Harlem. I guess the trance-flavored instrumental behind that one is still nice, but it does feel lower energy than most of the cuts that came before it, and Hyde kinda does this whole playground rhyming thing on top of it that I found a little annoying. Now sure, I may have been on board for Hyde's playground rhyming on STAR, but it worked a lot better there because A, it felt like a backdoor way for him to shout out his inspirations, B, he had a lot more energy and his voice was given like this odd, menacing pitch down effect as a direct contrast to the playfulness of the rhyming, where here he just plays everything straight. And C, the drum and bass instrumental of STAR was way more engaging and interesting than the kind of pleasantly airy feel of this one that actually makes it feel more like they're making a kid's song. Again, it's not bad by any stretch, it's just kind of there, and not the kind of thing that leaves me itching to come back to it. And if that felt like a mild slowdown in pacing, it's nothing compared to following track Octavia, which shows Esme Bronwyn Smith just doing pure spoken word over a much slower and sparser downtempo instrumental. Again, it's fine for what it is. I'm not one to complain about Underworld's downtempo tracks, and they've gotten similar ideas to work before, but it's just pretty aimless and meandering, not really anything special. At this point, it feels like the album's energy has just crashed and it never really recovers. Especially highlighted by the fact that it's followed by a minute-long interlude which is just an acapella reprise of Denver Luna, nothing but Hyde's vocals run through heavy vocoders, and is probably the most exciting part of the whole second half of the album. Feels like a quick burst of energy and context. At the very least, though, it's also followed by an example of how the band going lower key can still result in standouts, as seen on the 9-minute Gene Pool. While the trance-ish build-ups throughout this one, going alongside Hyde's melancholic crooning about cutting a hole in the news, can feel like a less energetic or exciting take on sounds heard earlier on the album. There is a more delicate and emotional charm to that one that the earlier cuts don't have to the same extent, and the track does still lead to some solid dramatic payoffs, especially near the end of its running time. I almost kind of wish the album had ended there. That would have probably made for a solid closer. Though there's still 3 more tracks to come after that, and this final stretch is probably the weakest part of the album. O Thorn could have worked as it has a cool, colorful mix of lusher ambient pads in the beginning, though then it kind of floats into a limp a cappella reprise of the playground rhyming from King of Harlem. You didn't need to bring that back. Iron Bones is another downtempo cut featuring another female guest singer in Nina Nastasia. Sorry for butcher pronunciations. Her more delicate performance is nice, and there's a somewhat offbeat and abstract flavor to the instrumental that could be interesting in theory, but it unfortunately just kinda ends up feeling a little weak and underwhelming, all sleepy and aimless, like all the instrumental elements are looping away independently of each other without ever coming together into something greater than the sum of their parts. Or even sometimes feeling like they belong together in the same mix. And it really gets ruined near the end when her voice gets filtered through this horrific high-pitched filter that sounds terrible and totally undercuts whatever lullaby-type vibe the track was going for before. And the album ends on a 2-minute solo acoustic guitar piece called Stickman Test, which is a thing that exists. I guess it kinda brings the album around full circle, ending with an inessential interlude not unlike the way the album started, though I feel like even Black Poppies hit more of an actual emotional note than this outro did. This is just like the definition of an anticlimax finish. So yeah, that's everything on Strawberry Hotel. Bit of a mixed bag, I guess, and it did marginally shrink on me the more times I put it on, but There is a lot of really good stuff here. That first half did go pretty dang hard and gave me all the spacey and semi-improvisational but still propulsive and exciting vibes that I'd want out of new Underworld material. And the second half, despite all the ragging I've done on it, is still perfectly listenable and decent at worst. The only part I actively disliked was the ending of Iron Bones, and even the rest of that track was fine. This album can feel a little like it's playing things safe, lacks the transcendental heights that Drift's high points could give me, but, you know, it's delivering a lot of the same qualities that made the material from Drift work as well as it did, and repackaging it in a much more easily approachable manner. And frankly, the album's best moments are like just one extra chained up or extended instrumental passage away from hitting those heights as well. This obviously is not going to hold a candle to their classic stuff, but I'll still take this over some of those middle period albums like Oblivion with Bells, Barking, or Barbara Barbara. It's just Underworld doing their usual thing, sticking to what's always worked for them, and doing it well. Their usual fans will be fed with more of what they'd want and expect. New fans can find a possible jumping on point that will be sufficiently representative of their core appeal and what they're about, even if I'd obviously more highly recommend their 90s stuff as your jumping on point if you really want to get their hype more easily. And yeah, not much else to say really. Strawberry Hotel is just another solid Underworld album, and I'm feeling a strong 7.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.